This episode of Bookworm is brought to you by Factor Meals, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit. Get 50% off at factormeals.com/bookworm50 and use the code bookworm50. Welcome back to Bookworm. We continue the tour of special guests on Bookworm. So today I have with me my buddy Mike Vardy. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Mike. How's it going? Really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am excited to talk about this book with you today. I know you mentioned that you have not only read it, I believe you've talked to the author.
I've read Brad's other book, The Practice of Groundedness, before this one.
Gotcha.
So I was a big fan of, and we've had a few exchanges on Twitter. I did have a conversation with Brad related to that book. And when I saw this one was coming out, well, actually, I knew it was coming out, and then you mentioned the book. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm totally going to be getting that book. And you asked if I wanted to talk about it. I'm like, okay, so I went and got the book, which is not typical. Normally, the podcast, like if I'm going to have somebody on my show, they'll send me a copy of the book. But I like Brad's work, what I see from him online, not just his past books, but also his discourse on Twitter, or X, I guess. And he's definitely diving more into things like Instagram. I just really, dig what he's talking about. And so, yeah, I thought, hey, let's have a conversation. And then I just emailed him and said, hey, picked up your new book, let's have you on my show again. So hopefully that's going to happen at some point as well.
Awesome. Well, this is the book that I heard about basically from you. So you were the natural person to have this on. I'm curious, have you, do you listen to Cal Newport's podcast at all?
On and off. So, I mean, I the last 2 episodes as of this recording, I definitely added to my Overcast queue. Which I think the latest one is like, why are you tired? And because I'm so interested in like the night owl and body clock stuff, I'm going to dive into that one. And then there was one you recommended to me that I definitely should listen to, which is the one about like starting your year at a different time, which is also what I do, right? Like don't start in January. So
Yeah, I heard him talking about starting the year later and I thought of you right away.
yeah.
Well, he did an interview with Brad that was really good. You can tell that they have had conversations before and there's good chemistry between them, but I really enjoyed that article and it got me real excited for this book. I guess we should back up just a little bit here right at the beginning, and I'll let you point people to the appropriate place. I would introduce you, but you have so many things going on that I'm not sure where you want me to send people.
The biggest focus I have right now, there's two. Well, I mean, I guess there's two. It's really interesting because over the years, Productivityist has kind of grown into, more of a membership community through the time crafting approach and framework that I teach. So you can still go to productivityist.com and you'll see my podcast, the blog posts, all that stuff. But in the upper right corner of productivityist.com, you'll see like Join Time Crafting Trust Premium. And I'm spending a lot more time in there, hanging out with my community. We have, I think, about 700 people in the community overall and about 200 premium members of the community. So I'm spending a lot of time there. That's one portion, I guess. And then the other portion is, working on, I've got the Productivity Diet book that's in the process of getting ready for launch. And I've got a couple other kind of writing projects that are in the works as well. So, I mean, between running that part of the business as, the productivityist part, for lack of a better term, and then my writing part, which is, how I got started in this whole thing in the first place. And then, I mean, that coupled with the changes that are going on in my life personally, with my daughter now 18, and as of this recording, literally before we hit record, her and my wife were WhatsApping back and forth while my daughter is discussing like the challenges of, European travel for the next 4 months. So that phase of change, all of those things kind of, oddly enough, when I saw Brad's got a book coming out about change, I'm like, yeah, let's dig into that. But yeah, primarily, you send people to productivityist.com, they're going to get to Time Crafting Trust, and then from there, the books and all that stuff. So
Cool. Well, Productivityist is the thing that I first came in contact with. And short personal story here. When I first started writing online, before I joined Agent Efficiency even, I decided to start a blog and start writing consistently. And I think I published like 3 or 4 blog posts at that point before I mentioned an old episode of Mike's on Mike's that I had listened to where you talked about your words for the year. And I'm like, that's a cool idea. And I linked to it. And I was the happiest kid in Disneyland when Mike Vardy showed up on my blog to leave a nice comment long before I knew who you were. So that sticks with me, and I appreciate you taking the time to fill in for Joe here. Let's jump into the book. Actually, before we jump into the book, I should make one other announcement because I currently have an Obsidian cohort going, but I also have an Obsidian 101 self-paced course now available. So if you didn't get into the cohort, if you joined the cohort, great, thank you. You already have access to this course, but it is now publicly available for everyone who did not join the cohort. It's $97, but that whole cost can be applied towards a future cohort, because the idea of this is that it kind of lays the foundation, it gets you up to speed with the fundamentals of Obsidian so that you can dive deeper into like the values-based productivity and creativity workflows that I talk about in the PKM stack, which was the subject of the last email and the last YouTube video. I'll put links to that stuff in the show notes for people. But it's about 2 hours worth of self-paced videos. If you want to go through that, you can find out more information and see a sample video. Get the whole table of contents at obsidianuniversity.com/101. All right. So let's jump in here to the book. Now, Masters of Change. Normally, this is the part where we talk about with Joe who picked this, why did they pick it. This was just something that when you first mentioned that this book was out there, and I saw the title, I was like, I need this book right now. Because I feel like I am in a season where everything is changing. It's kind of weird to say that, being 6 months now almost removed from the decision to go full-time independent creator, but still trying to get my feet underneath me, figure things out. In the middle of all that, Joe has stuff going on and he can no longer be on Bookworm. And I remember having that first conversation. I was like, this is the last thing that I need right now. So this book, I picked this up hoping to find a few mindsets and tactics that could just help me. I don't like to use the word cope, but that's really the thing.
Yeah.
There was a lot going on, and I just wanted to get a little bit of stability. So that's what I was looking for with this. It's a short book. It's got 3 parts, but it's only 6 chapters. So we'll probably go through this, plus an introduction and a conclusion. We'll probably go through this chapter by chapter. But I'm curious, when you first picked up the book, Mike, what was your first impression, or what were you expecting from this book?
Well, first off, having read Brad's book, The Practice of Groundedness, before this one, which, by the way, was my introduction to Brad's work. I know he's written, The Passion Paradox, I believe is the name of one of the other books he's written. But he is a peak performance coach, right? And it's funny you say that, the time, this is a time for you to read. This book couldn't have come along at a better time, even though you're 6 months into the process. Well, the only constant is change, right? So, reading it right now was something I'm like, yeah, I'm going through some change right now. And, I know the way that Brad's writing. It's funny you mentioned Cal. I think Cal and Brad have a very similar style of writing. I think Brad's writing is maybe a little bit, I'm not going to say less academic, because I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think it's just presented differently. I think if you like Cal Newport's writing, I think you'll like Brad's if you want if you want to be more of a layperson, I guess, for lack of a better term.
They're 2 peas in a pod for sure.
Yeah, they are. But I think, so that was what kind of made me want to read it. Now, what's interesting, you say it's a short book. There are lots of short books out there that are heavier reads than they belies how deep they go, right? I was surprised at how the book was constructed in terms of the chapters, in terms of, breaking into 3 parts is not uncommon, but I think this book was not one that, and we talked about this, it's one that I'm going to have to go over again for sure, because going through it for the purposes of this conversation, which I love doing, is different than me just sitting and reading with it, like sitting with it. And I think that there's elements of this book that you need to sit with, and going into reading this, if you're going to pick it up, I would recommend that you kind of read a chapter, or, I mean, you could get away with reading a part and sitting with that part, dwelling on it over a few days, but it's not a speed read. It may be a quick read, but it's not a, like, you can get through it in, a weekend and get the most out of it, right? You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, that's totally fair. This is definitely a meaty book. The way it's constructed, part 1 is rugged and flexible mindset. Part 2 is rugged and flexible identity. Part 3 is rugged and flexible actions. Just by the titles there of the different parts, it feels like this is a very focused book. And you mentioned that it's not unusual for books like this to have 3 parts. That's kind of a running joke on Bookworms. Like, hey, look, this book has 3 parts, because they all have 3 parts.
Yeah, it's not to be fair, it's not any kind of initialism or acronym in those 3 parts. So it's not like some kind of code word. Believe me, I read plenty of books that have, like, and I love me a good acronym or a good initialism, but this one stays away from it.
Yeah, but what I like about this, I think, is typically when you have the 3 parts, it's trying to cover a whole bunch of different things and tie them together loosely. And by using the term rugged and flexible for each one of these, it kind of puts firm boundaries around the scope of this particular book. So Master of Change, that title could actually go a bunch of different directions. But he's focusing solely on this rugged and flexible idea, which he introduces in the introduction. So maybe we should talk about that here first, because the introduction is where he lays the groundwork, and this is the most dense introduction, I think, of any book that I've ever read, because he uses a whole bunch of scientific terms and defines a whole bunch of stuff. He talks about the rugged and flexible thing, and then he talks about the way that people deal with change and disorder events, which is something that fundamentally shifts our experience of ourselves in the world that we inhabit. Now, what's interesting about that disorder event, I think it's in this first section, he talks about how we encounter a bunch of these throughout our life. The average person goes through like 38 of them, 36, I forget, in the scope of a lifetime, which is a lot. And being in one right now, I can tell you, you're not like counting it off and being like, well, there's one down, 35 more to go. Like, you're just trying to get through the one that you're in.
Yep.
So I feel like this is a potentially, anyways, at the very beginning here, a very helpful book. And I like the fact that he defines that change is neutral. Change is change, right? Reminds me of something Ernie said at our retreat. I don't mind what happens.
Yep. Well, and I think the other thing is he is very much and if you've listened to Brad's other like interviews, like Rich Roll, he's been on Rich Roll's podcast a few times. I just listened to the most recent episode, which is related to this book. He is very much a person who likes to steer from extremes, right? So he looks for the and more than the or when it comes to a lot of this stuff. That's why you see rugged and flexible mindset. Those things may seem to, they're not any of the parts, rugged and flexible mindset, rugged and flexible identity, rugged and flexible actions. Those 2 words that describe each of them, rugged and flexible, they may seem like they are, not opposites, but they may not seem like they necessarily go together. And that's where he spends his time. And in the introduction, he really kind of, I think that's one of the things, he not only gets into like the science behind it and things you haven't thought about, but I think he's combating maybe the term change management, this idea of, how to, he's not really into managing change. I think it's interesting that as I was reading it, he's interested in helping you manage your relationship with change. Mm-hmm. And that really spoke to me, especially because that's what I think about when I think about time for the work I do. Is I'm not trying to help people manage time. Time will not be managed. Time moves on whether you want it to or not. But managing your response, managing your relationship, managing, like, that's really what he's kind of focusing on, especially when he gets into the idea of homeostasis versus, which we'll get into, all that stuff. But I felt that the introduction, first off, as I was going through the introduction, I didn't realize I was still in the introduction at certain parts.
Yeah.
That's how far it was in. But it wasn't like, I didn't feel like, as I was reading it, like, oh, here we go, like, let's get into it. It wasn't like this is going to be a slog. It was just, I think he was just, again, setting the table based on managing expectations. And I think that taking the time to do that, I wonder if he had to fight for that. I wonder if he had to fight with his editor to get an introduction in there that long, or if he had to, like, otherwise he would have ended up with having to divide part 3 into 4 parts or something like that. Like, what is change could have very easily been like that whole thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But he really wants to define rugged and flexible here. And it takes a little while to get there, obviously, because he talks about the disorder events. He talks about changes neutral. You mentioned homeostasis. He defines that here, which is just the process of things going to disorder and then back again. And that's what people want, typically. He talks about the 4 ways people usually respond to change: attempt to avoid it or refuse to acknowledge it, actively resist it, sacrifice agency amidst chaos, and try to get back to where we were. But then he defines allostasis, which is the stability through change. So instead of going from order to disorder back to order, it's order to disorder to reorder. So it's something new that comes from the process of the change.
That to me is the thing that he needs to drive home. It's almost, again, in your work, in my work, in even the stuff that I think a lot of people approach, there's these old tropes that are tired and they're not aligned with the way the world works now necessarily, but they're so ingrained. And homeostasis, he like, that's why we talk about homeostasis. Like, you learned about homeostasis in school in relation to, biology and all that stuff, right? So you kind of, but then allostasis, I don't think I've ever heard that phrase before. And if I have, I certainly haven't heard it in such a concentrated way throughout an entire, book or article even. And what I love about it is this idea that he's saying, look, when something changes, it is never the same again. I know he deftly trods the line, when he talks about polarizing topics. Again, he's more of a this and that person. And I'm jumping a bit, but I mean, the bottom line is that the idea of order, disorder, order, he's driving home the point that what was order before is never order again. There's a process of reordering, and he's really trying to drive that home. And I guess, I don't know how you felt about this, but as he was doing this, I'm like, this is why rugged and flexible applies, because I know it would scare the crap out of people to hear that, oh no, you mean it's true, things never do go back. And he's using, like, not anecdotal evidence in its entirety, which happens a lot in these, in books like this, but actual data, like studies and, empirical stuff that, makes you think twice about it.
Yeah, exactly. The rugged flexibility, that's basically you're tough enough to adapt and change, which you're right. Those terms don't necessarily seem like they go together, but it makes sense when you realize that healthy systems don't resist change. They adapt to it. They move forward with grace and grit, as he puts it.
Yep.
So, yeah, really powerful idea. And I guess you could make the argument at this point that whole section of the introduction, that's the crux of the idea. I mean, the next 3 parts are going to unpack it a lot further. I know I've read a lot of books where it could have been a blog post. I don't feel that way about this one, but that there's a complete thought inside of that introduction.
Mm-hmm.
You could read just that part, get a lot out of it, but it also sets the stage for everything else.
It's almost like a thesis that he's writing. You know what I mean? Like, he's writing it.
Good point.
And the rest of the book is like this is what I'm going to challenge, and here are my next 3 parts that will help me challenge this idea that change, we don't know. We need to understand what change truly is in order for us to cope with it. Not control it, not any of that, just cope and adjust our responses to it.
Yep. Use it for our purposes. I get the idea of, like, surfing the wave sort of a thing.
Leverage it. Yeah. I know I said the leverage word, but still it's true. That's how you master something, right? To a degree, right? You know how to leverage it in the best way possible.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I heard about from Dan Sullivan, I think, the experience transformer. And that transformer word is the key one. It's like this thing happened. And he's a business coach. So he's talking about this thing happened in business. And maybe it's something you didn't want to have happen, but you can go through the experience transformer, which is like a PDF worksheet, and figure out essentially, okay, this thing happened. Now, what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to move forward essentially from
Yep.
this disruptive event?
It reminded me. It reminded me of, again, I take my lessons from not just books, but from movies and TV shows, like Vision in Age of Ultron, saying something isn't beautiful because it lasts, right? Walter Mitty, it's like, sometimes all a moment wants is your attention, like things like that. And in this instance, I very much was like, and Vision said the same thing. Chaos. Humans are odd. They think that chaos or order are different things when they're really two sides of the same coin, right? And so I was open to this. I think that's the other thing too. I imagine, looking at the catalog of books that Bookworm is, you really have to be. By the time you're done the introduction, you're either in or out.
True.
You'll either put the book down to read it when you're ready, or you'll put the book down and go, whatever, dude, or you'll dive in. Right. I think that and there's something to be said for that, because that in and of itself is the whole point. Like if you make it past the introduction, I think, like, and kind of like, hey, either with a curiosity mindset or with, like, if you remove judgment from it and go into, then that proves you have a mindset that's capable. We all have mindsets, and we have the ability to kind of thrust those qualities of ruggedness and flexibility into all of those things he talks about. When you read the introduction and you're like, yep, all right, let's go, then, and I think that, I don't know if that was Brad's purpose. It'll be interesting because I think you might be talking to him at some point too. I'm not sure entirely, but you guys, we're all trying to connect with him.
We've reached out. Yeah.
Yeah. But the point is that, once it's not just like it's not an opening salvo, but it's almost like, all right, I don't want to waste your time necessarily. This is what I believe. This is what the evidence is showing. Let's move forward together. And at that point in time, you're either going to go along for the ride, or you're going to, pace it at your own pace, or just get off the ride altogether.
Yep. And I appreciate that approach.
Yeah.
Let's jump into the first part here. And maybe we do this chapter by chapter. Maybe we just take this part by part, because I don't have a whole lot of notes for the first chapter, which is open to the flow of life. The big ideas here: change is rarely ever easy. Resisting change can actually cause psychological and physical suffering. So you don't want to do that to yourself. And that gets into kind of like the opposite of the rugged and flexible, which on the surface feels, when you hear the terms like rugged and flexible, those sound like positive terms. And then the negative version of that would be weak and rigid. But if you think about these, it's really just kind of flipping the order. So I feel like there's not a really big line here between these two. But weak and rigid essentially is that you don't have the strength to weather change, but you cling desperately to the way things used to be. And this kind of reminded me of a saying I've heard previously: strong convictions lightly held. That's kind of the opposite of the weak and rigid. That's going back into like the rugged and flexible. But it's strong convictions, so I really believe what I believe, but lightly held, I'm willing to change my mind if presented with new and better information. The opposite of that, the weak and rigid version, is I'm not really quite sure what I believe. I'm not willing to take a stance on anything, but I view any additional information as a threat.
Yeah. And that's all rooted in fear, right? The fear of change, the fear of the unknown. And I think the interesting thing about when rigidity is, you're right, there's a very thin line. I remember talking to Joey from Baron Fig about this when we were talking about time crafting at one point. And he said that your system seems rather rigid, like theme days. And this is the day that I'm like, yeah, but I don't say, for example, that on Tuesday, it's the day that I focus. It's Trustworthy Tuesday because I focus on time crafting trust. It doesn't mean it's the only thing I'm doing. I'm sitting here right now talking to you. It's having it's having something there that you can rely on, that you can use as a default. And I think that's really where the line is this. Patrick Rohn's talked about this idea of sensible defaults, right? Like those two things, default doesn't necessarily make sense a lot of times. I mean, we get a new device and the defaults work for the device, but they don't necessarily work for us. So rigidity to me, for one person, and this is where it gets tricky, it can be, oh, this is way too rigid. But for another person, it can be, well, it's just structured enough. And again, flexibility could be so far like, well, you go into the day with absolutely no focus at all, right? Like you go into life with like, well, I'll just go whichever way the wind blows. But that doesn't necessarily work either. That's where the ruggedness, that comes with the dealing of it. I think the weak part is that you rely more on I wouldn't say the constraints, maybe, but it is such it's such a delicate tightrope, and we can all fall into it. I think that's the other thing too, is that the way that this part works, and this chapter, I think in particular, kind of says you need to be open to things not going the way that you expect. Like, and it doesn't mean that they will not go the way, but you need to be open to the fact that, for lack of better, life is suffering, right? Or whatever, like those edicts. He brings up a lot of I know that faiths come up in the book on a couple of occasions, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I think that this whole part is about, and he talks about like flow and fluidity and things like that, which are hard for humans to that want to accomplish, achieve, make their way through the world with just this. Again, it's black and white for them. Oh, yeah. Man, I need to have it's too laissez-faire. It's too this, it's too that. And then there's others that are I need to be exactly like this. It's got to be. And he's basically, no, it's both. I remember in the I think it was in the introduction. And again, I'm jumping back a bit, but he says decision-making is not about reason or emotion. It's about reason and emotion.
Yeah, that's the non-dual thinking. It's not either or, it's both and, yep.
Right. And this whole idea, which again, rugged and flexible gets into, but this idea of and I like the fact that mindset, the order of these parts are very important. Mindset, identity, and then actions. Because in order for you to be able to deal with the next two parts, that mindset needs to be both rugged and flexible. Otherwise, or it needs to default to that.
Yeah.
So that way you can get through the other two. Because without that, you're not going to be able to necessarily, develop what you need in part 2 and part 3.
Yeah. Well, I think you're hitting on something that is kind of unpacked in chapter 2, which is expect it to be hard. The weak and the rigid thing that you were talking about, the reason that things are weak and rigid is that we feel like it's a threat, and that's
right.
why we try to avoid it. And he talks about in chapter 2 that happiness is reality minus expectations, and also that Western culture places this pressure, and I can totally see this, on everyone to be happy. So if you are facing something or you're going through something, then that's out of order. That's something that's wrong. That should not be happening to you. It's unfair. And I think he would say that you got to discard that thinking. And the worst way to be happy is to try and be happy all the time. He talks about Viktor Frankl, The Man's Search for Meaning, which, that book just rocked my world when we read it. But he brings up the idea of the tragic optimism, which is the ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain, loss, and suffering. So the minute that you don't view that stuff as a critical error to the system and it's just something to be dealt with, it doesn't seem like as big a deal. But when you try to prevent it, that's the other thing from this chapter that really hit me, is that resistance is a multiplier to the pain. So suffering equals pain times resistance. It's not additive, it's multiplied.
Mm-hmm.
So if you really are thinking like this is absolutely incorrect and it shouldn't be. And I mean, there probably are places where you need to draw those lines, but you can't do it every single time you encounter something that's difficult.
No, because that actually will make you unhappy.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Which is the irony of it all, right? You know what I mean? Like, and again, this comes back to the non-dual thinking and also Brad's fairly consistent stance of it's the and not the or, right? Like, so you can't be, if you're happy all the time, then, or striving to be happy all the time, then it can actually make you miserable, right? Because there's forces at play that, not everything will go our way, right? And when I was reading that chapter, I kept thinking about this idea of contentment, right? And that's actually one of the words that I use for this year is, contentment. I want to experience contentment more often than, even happiness or sadness. I'm not going to kind of deflect happiness, but I know darn well that, you can't have happiness without sadness. And I don't want to be on either side of that spectrum for too long, right? You know what I mean? Because with happiness, you can be in this state of euphoria where you can miss things, right? You can, in the world that it is, because again, there's outside forces at play. Change is always happening, right? There's this impermanence that, in fact, I would say that the impermanence almost invariably will make us unhappy because of the change involved. And then, but obviously you don't want to be sad all the time either, because that's a chasm that's very, challenging to climb out of. But if you can, again, emotion and reason, right? Later on, we get into like the idea of independence and interdependence. And I think what's fascinating about this book, Mike, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, as we is that there's a permissiveness and almost a validation that comes out throughout this book of like, oh, all right, so I'm in a good, going in with this mindset, this attitude, this, removal of, again, putting it all together, I can deal with whatever life throws my way, which will be change, right? So yeah, I found that fascinating, this idea of, tragic optimism. There you go. Like there's a classic like oxymoron, right? Like how can optimism be tragic? Well, he talks about, does he get into the self-help development stuff? I think he does at that point.
He does a little bit, but really that's tied to something back in chapter 1, being is better than having. When your identity, right, which is kind of getting the next section, so we won't go there quite yet, but when your identity is based on what you have, when the things you have get taken away, it is not just you've lost the stuff, but you've lost a piece of yourself. And the tragic optimism recognizes that things may happen, things may be taken away from me, but that doesn't change who I am. And that's the thing that allows you to find hope and meaning and purpose in the midst of the day-to-day.
Yeah. What does he say? He says, a having orientation is static and intolerant to change. Yep. A being orientation is dynamic and open to change.
Right. With the busy fall season already in swing, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for jam-packed days. And Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, can help you fuel up fast with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals that are delivered straight to your door. You can save time, eat well, and stay on track with your healthy lifestyle. Too busy to cook but want to make sure that you're still eating well? Well, with Factor, you can do just that. You can skip the extra trip to the grocery store and all the chopping, prep, and cleaning up too, while still getting the flavor and nutritional quality that you need. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes. So all you have to do is heat it up and enjoy. That's what I love about Factor. It's so fast. It fits into even the busiest of schedules. So if you're too busy running around during the day to think about lunch, you can still keep your energy up with Factor's lunch to go options, which are effortless, wholesome meals like grain bowls and salad toppers. And they're ready to eat when you're on the go, no microwave required. You can round out your meal and replenish your snack supply with an assortment of over 45 add-ons, which include things like delicious apple cinnamon pancakes, bacon and cheddar egg bites, and potato bacon and egg breakfast skillets. Or for an easy wellness boost, try refreshing beverage options like cold-pressed juices, shakes, and smoothies. This September, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals that are delivered right to your door. Ready in just 2 minutes, no prep, no mess. So head over to factormeals.com/bookworm50 and use the code bookworm50 and you can get 50% off. That's code bookworm50 at factormeals.com/bookworm50 to get 50% off. Our thanks to Factor Meals for their support of the Bookworm Podcast. Yeah, so actually, if you are good with it, we can move on to the next chapter because I feel like this is the perfect segue. In chapter 3, we're talking about cultivating a fluid sense of self, and this is all based in the identity, so the being instead of the having. He talks about how we've got many lenses that we look at the world through. The best athletes are the ones who are both independent and interdependent. So again, not either or, but both and again when they are on the field. So they are who they are regardless of where they are, but also their environment does play a role. There is a factor there. Now, one of the things that I appreciate about Brad is that he is a runner who has dealt with injuries. I know exactly what that's like. So he talked about identity, and he was a big runner, and I think he had to have surgery, so he couldn't run anymore. And then he got into some other stuff like powerlifting and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the identity he had was as a runner.
Right.
And I literally did this. My first half marathon that I ran, I overtrained. The patella tendon slipped off my kneecap onto the side of my leg during the race, and I remember being in a lot of pain as I finished. But you know, I had set this goal 18 months earlier. I had trained really hard. I was going to finish it no matter what. I actually ran through the pain, finished with a really great time, better than I was hoping to, but also knew that I was not going to repeat that anytime soon. So I literally crossed the finish line, and like this depression came over me. It's like, what do I do now? It's like I accomplished that. I mean, this gets into goals versus identity-based habits a little bit too, because I had set that goal, I achieved it. Now the immediate gratification wore off in like 10 seconds because I knew the next goal to set was to like run another race, but also I had months of rehab in front of me, so that was not going to be an option. And then it's like, who am I?
Well, and he brings up early on, he actually tells a bit more about the story in the Rich Roll episode where he's interviewed. He talks about, was it Niels van der Poel, who was the speed skater, right? I think it was the speed skater, if I remember correctly. And basically he wrote like a PDF that said like how to train for like a race and then like a half race or whatever it was. And I encourage you, we should put this in the show, like listen to that Rich Roll, because they have a really interesting conversation, because Rich Roll's a runner too, right? So they have I think that's how they were friends initially, and you know, what have you. But what's interesting is just the back and forth about like what Van der Poel said about training, because what the crux is that he didn't want his identity to be tied to the fact that he was an athlete, and that's what, you know, so he would do things like on the weekends, he would go hang out with his friends, he'd go have drinks, he'd be more social like that, and would just not train on those days. And having that fluid sense of self, which again, fluid comes up, we're getting like, again, that flexibility, all that stuff. But keep in mind that talking about this idea of, you know, training heavily during the week, it doesn't displace that part of the identity. The key is to make sure that you don't get wrapped up in this is what because we talked about earlier, like, and Eric Fromm comes up in the book about, you know, to be, to have, all that stuff. But again, removing that possessiveness, like I have this, or I need to do this, because if I don't, then who am I? It's about letting that go. And it's interesting, we talked about this earlier on. One thing that can have your identity take a hit is like your kid leaving. Like, you know, my daughter's gone for 4 months. I mean, I have my son here too, so it's not like I'm not a parent anymore, right? But my parenting has had to change, right? Like, to let go of the fact that my daughter is, as of this moment of recording, getting ready to leave Paris and go to Spain, and is dealing with like the travel woes of a 18-year-old traveling through Europe, which again, first world problem, right? But
It's a disorder
that
event for sure.
change, yeah. But that idea of like when we're all done, like, and when I think there's moments you talked about, like the different types of stages where change and that stuff shows up. Number one, you can't predict it. Number two, I think when one happens and you're open to this, and again, maybe that's why this book was so needed for me right now. You're like, well, what happens in another year when she goes to university? What happens in 5 years when my son's gone? Like, then who am I? Because it doesn't necessarily mean but that's the other thing too, is it's not necessarily tied to a career.
Yeah.
It's tied to like personal stuff, right? So I think that going through that last chapter and then into part 2, I think kind of is like, and I love the way that it ties those together, right? I love the way that it kind of, it warms you up for what's to come, because I think part 2 it's the middle, it's the messy middle, it's the hard part.
Yep.
So when he says expect it to be hard earlier on in the book, it's like not just the change part, but like the thing you're going to need to do after this part. Like, we're stealing your mindset to be rugged and flexible so that you can have the ability to have a rugged and flexible identity.
But there's also something in this chapter that irks me. So he talks about our sense of self is dynamic and changing. Perfect. I agree with that. Conventional self is the present self. It's individual and stable. Got it. The ultimate self, the self connected with everyone and everything around it, always changing. Makes sense. Then I have something in my notes. This is the first time I have taken a note on something that I felt should have been in the book, but was missing. Are you familiar with the story of Theseus's ship?
Oh, I just told you all the vision stuff. Yeah, the ship of Theseus, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a whole scene.
Yeah, this is the perfect metaphor for this, and he doesn't talk about it. I feel like he didn't.
I know.
I feel like he didn't put the period on the end of the sentence. It's like that is naturally where my mind was going. Is you got to have not that specific story, but something like that. It's like a thought experiment. For those who aren't familiar, the story of Theseus's ship. Theseus is the guy who went and slew the Minotaur in Greek mythology, and so they brought the ship back. It's in the museum, and slowly over time, it's in the harbor. It's wearing out, so they're replacing piece by piece. Eventually, every piece of Theseus's ship is replaced. The thought experiment is it still Theseus's ship? Because it's not the materials that made up the ship, it's the identity of the ship. Same thing applies to us as humans, I believe. So there needed to be something like that where it's like you're going to be changing, your identity is going to evolve, and the pieces that made up who you were previously are not going to be the same, and that's okay.
Well, and the interdependent and independent makes total sense there too, because the ship of Theseus, these boards are constantly being replaced. Like if they don't replace them, then the ship sinks. Right? You know what I mean? So there is this ability, like, I think there's that there too. Yeah, I mean, there's a great scene from WandaVision where, Vision, that's the, spoiler alert, not the real Vision, and actual Vision have a, this came out like almost 2 years ago, so if you haven't seen it, oh well. They're having like, they're in the middle of this massive fight, these two powerful Marvel heroes. And then the way they resolve their fight is they discuss the ship of Theseus. And it's so well done because at the end, it solves the problem. They stop fighting. It's like, you're right. We are, I'm this part of you. You're this part. Let's mesh. And Real Vision now has every part of what the, imagined Vision has and takes off, right? So now that Vision is whole once again. There was such an opportunity, but I also wonder if he left it out because the ship of Theseus problem has been brought up. It's like the trolley problem, right? Like it comes up many times in many different books. But you're right. It would have definitely driven the point home.
Yeah, that's possible. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure he's heard the story before. If I were to talk to him, I maybe not publicly, but I would love to ask him directly, like, why did you not use some sort of structure there? Because it links perfectly to the next chapter.
Yep.
I mean, the next chapter is chapter 4, Develop Rugged and Flexible Boundaries. And the big idea he talks about in this chapter is core values. I mean, I love this. We've got
Mm-hmm.
family core values that are printed and hanging on our living room wall. I am all about the values. I've got my life theme email course, which is how to make your own personal mission statement, which is big step of that is identifying your core values. It's the core of the personal retreat stuff that I do. So core values are something that you can always control. And he's got some advice for selecting 3 to 5, writing a sentence about each, and then asking, how might I move in the direction of my core values? I think that's all like great advice. But again, don't be upset about having to replace a board. Maintain the identity that the values give you. I mean, it's right there.
One of the things, and I think this comes back to especially the boundaries part, where people will say to me, and this is where the mindset needs to feed the second part, the identity. So again, back to Joey's thing of like, well, you have a daily theme, but that seems really rigid. I'm like, no, it's rugged and flexible. Well, what do you mean? Well, I say my overarching focus on Tuesday is this stuff. But if something pops up, I'm able to deal with it. But then then I can immediately, my brain has a direction to go in, right? Like I have, and again, this leads again into part 3, which is why I really enjoyed there was so much speaking to me in this book, but this idea of boundaries, and rugged, I think one of the things that I would love to see happen, and there's other books out here that talk about boundaries, and maybe that's where people need to go, because they're I can't remember, was it Dr. Henry Cloud, I think, that wrote the book Boundaries, to talk about that idea of establishing them, because I think that as I mentioned, we're now in the tough part, like who sits and develops core values. Like I know you do, I've spent time with it, but it requires a lot of you to do that.
It does.
And
yep.
you want to future-proof them, right? You want to be able to have them stand the test of time and whatever time throws at it. So this is where I think what he did in this chapter was he couldn't go too deep on it, because there are books out there about boundaries, but he talks about, was it Durante, the actress that had, that did a bunch of different things. It was the blend, right? But one of the things he says, which should, in the context of this book, have people kind of going, okay, I need to spend time with it. Core values also, quote, play an important role during periods of change, disorder, and uncertainty. Like they're not the boundaries per se, but they're the rock. They're the North Star. They're the reason that people have challenging times with it, and they'll use things like, I don't have time to sit with this or whatever, is that they're afraid that they're making the wrong choices and that you can't change them, or that they won't apply to every situation. You have to work through that. That's the part you have to work through. And the other thing is again, there is no black and white. You will screw up. There will be instances where one value gets way more benefit from an action you take or a decision you make than another. There's no such thing as perfection in this. It's, again, and this is where Brad excels, because he talks about peak performance and things like that. So he's alluding to the fact, like, look, you put these in place, it's going to keep you on the right path more often than not. The key is that you need to know what the path is.
Yep.
You need like, everyone, has a different reason for being and how they want to operate on the path. You need to have that there so that you can make the right decisions while you're traversing the path.
Yeah, he defines core values as guiding principles. And that term, I went and looked it up because my introduction to this whole idea of like family core values was a getaway that my wife and I did when, let's see, it must have been 7 or 8 years old at least, in Google Drive. And we titled it Schmidt's Family Guiding Principles.
Mm-hmm.
And we identified the core values, the desired outcomes, how do we get there, the details with like all the habits and the routines that we wanted to establish. And so obviously I love this whole section. I do wish maybe he has, because this is the first book of Brad's that I've read, but I would love to read a book from Brad just about this core value stuff, because I feel like there's so much more he could get into with this, and he obviously knows what he's talking about with this section.
I don't remember if the practice of groundedness had it in there. I think there wasn't a mention of it. Again, and I mean, you've read enough books to know this by the same authors. You get to see like a body of work and where things go. We were talking to Chris Bailey, our friend Chris Bailey, about this too, because he's got a history, a bibliography that kind of, you can see the direction in which they're going based on what their subject matter is. And even Brad said like this is a book that he has been like thinking about for a long time and didn't really hit home until I think it was COVID-19 and his daughter growing. I think that those two things kind of were the catalyst, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And he talks about the idea of the core values being like the boundaries within, like helping to guide the decisions.
Yep.
And that the boundaries with you, that's what he means by rugged, is that they will change and morph like anything else. And they just make sure that they don't change too radically or in a direction that you don't want them to go. It would be interesting to see, but I think that the issue here is, and maybe he goes down this path more specifically because this is a niche within it, but this idea of identity and how values are associated with it. You could argue that Ryan Holiday has gotten into this to a greater degree as well and stuff like it, but no one's really sat down and go like either of those authors, if they said, here's how you like, and they were very overt about it, like, let's talk about developing your values. You're right. They kind of, I wouldn't say they dance around it necessarily, but they kind of leave you to your own devices a little bit, as opposed to like guidance, like real, kind of prescriptive guidance along the way. And maybe, I don't know what the reason for that is. Again, everybody adopts these values differently, so that would be a huge mountain to climb probably. But I agree with you. Like, there's definitely some stuff there that you could go into deeper, but to ask people to already start letting go of their identity as they know it and be more flexible and rugged with it, that might be the only battle that Brad's willing to take on in this particular book.
No, that's fair. I just want to find another resource that's going to dive deep in that, because honestly, like the core values stuff, my wife is actually working on the outline for a core values course. And I know that there's got to be other stuff out there, but most of it that I have found, I don't really like.
Well, and I think courses are where that would be at too. I think anything that kind of there's a bit of hand holding along the way.
Yep.
I think that the medium of the book can help, but it's kind of like, and he talks about, actually, interestingly enough, he talks about in earlier on in the book, like Enneagram and Myers-Briggs and all those tests and stuff like that. Like, having that awareness is one thing and knowledge is one thing. It's what you do with it, right? So I think that a workbook would be interesting. I'd love to, actually, you know what? If he was to do it in a workbook style, I think it could work. But in the confines of this, yeah, it would be tricky.
Yeah, I just want more, because most of the conversation, and the stuff that I've read about core values is very corporate core values-esque, and that kind of just puts people off, because a lot of times those are aspirational and vague and general, and we're going to change the world, and there's no real applicable value from that. It's too hard for the people who work in the organization to actually connect to those values and realize how to live them out every day, which kind of leads into the next section, unless you had something else that you wanted to say about that.
No. Let's keep going.
All right, cool. So part 3 is rugged and flexible actions. Chapter 5 is respond, not react. And
I love this.
There's a lot to unpack there. The basic idea with this chapter, now we've got the mindset and the identity. So how does that translate into our actions? And this is where we get into some of the more tactical stuff. This is what most of the productivity books are going to zero in on, is just this stuff. I appreciate that this is at the end. I feel like this is not an afterthought, but it's definitely in the right order, and the emphasis is on everything that has happened up until this point. So this is the part of the book I enjoyed the least, probably because I feel like this part of the book is the stuff that I've heard before. This is where we talk about the meditation can help you respond and not react, and the the 2 P's for reacting, which is panic and pummel, versus the 4 P's for responding, where you pause, process, plan, proceed. And I feel like if you're coming across that for the first time, that could be the aha moment that unlocks everything. So I don't fault it for being in there, but I feel like I've read this stuff before. I also don't really like the serenity prayer that he leans on in this section, which this is the kind of thing that you see like printed on the stuff in the Christian bookstores. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. It sounds good, but I feel like I've seen this so many places, and just it doesn't have the, I don't know, it doesn't have the impact maybe like when you first come across it.
Well, here's I think the crux of this chapter, and he mentions it in a very, like, your actions become more refined and aligned with your present moment reality and your values instead of with false perceptions or prior expectations. This is why it comes after that second part.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that why this is here, and remember, you and I, it's really important, I think, for me and you, but me as somebody who really talks about like processes in terms of productiveness and managing your relationship with time, to go, oh, here's another way forward. I didn't take it that way. I took it as people have made it through and now they need something to do. They need to start applying this now and not go pick up Getting Things Done or, any of the other, myriad of productivity books that are out there with processes in them. I think that his goal here is to have people start to push back against prior expectations and the perceptions that they have. It's about taking, again, what did he say? He says wise hope and wise action.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Like the wisdom part. He wants them to exercise the wisdom part. And that's where the whole, like, when you mentioned response versus react, that's huge, because reacting is very knee jerk. It leans more towards that primitive side of our brain that just wants to deal with it, like get like the fight or flight and all that. But a response requires thought,
mm-hmm.
requires fluidity, requires like that flexibility and that ruggedness. And it's harder because, again, you have to take a beat. And we live in a world that's engineered not to allow us to take a beat, or that feels like we can't take a beat, right? That pause is so powerful. And I think that the pause in this instance, if you're going through the book and you're like taking the lessons from it, is, okay, let's think about this in the proper way. Let's not tether it. Like, so it's the rewiring of the brain, for lack of a better term. So I think that while I've seen this, and yeah, I mean, he talks about Epictetus and he talks about, we are what we repeat. Like, there's stuff that we've seen before based on the books that we read, and that's going to happen. But I think that that's why that's here, is to kind of say, okay, I've given you, like, I've prepared you for this. Now let's start. This is where the rubber meets the road. And don't forget about this other stuff, because that stuff's going to allow you to respond rather than react. And remember, responsiveness is also, like, people go, oh, well, it's either proactive or reactive. No, it's not.
Yep.
Because proactivity lives inside of responsiveness, right? And reactivity lives inside of responsiveness too. So it's the and factor again that I think that is really powerful here.
I agree. I kind of wish I didn't have the background I had with the family business for this part, because he gets into the brain science and he uses a bunch of terms which are slightly different than the ones that I would use. And I don't think I agree 100% with the conclusions that he draws here. But generally...
Are you talking about the rage and seeking pathways? Are you talking about that?
Yeah. So, like, I had not heard these terms before, and it kind of makes sense that you have these different pathways that your emotions can go down. But understanding what I do understand about brain science, I don't think it's as simple as like funneling it down the right pathway, because permit me to nerd out here for a minute.
Sure, go for it.
When something happens, your brain's trying to make sense of it, and part of it goes straight to the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, and that's the one that triggers the fight or flight response. And part of it, it takes a little bit longer, but it goes to the prefrontal cortex where it's analyzed for meaning, and that's where you can respond appropriately. So when the amygdala overrides the prefrontal cortex, that triggers what's called emotional hijacking. That
Right.
feels way more powerful as a picture than there's these two pathways, the rage pathway and the seeking pathway.
And that's evolutionarily designed that way. Like that's the older part of our brain. That's the one that's like, if I don't get out of the way or do something, I will die. Right?
Yeah. So the pause, to your point, is powerful, and it's important because it allows the prefrontal cortex to catch up. So you don't fly off the handle it's not just the rage. It's not just getting angry. Like that could be the case, but it's not necessarily. It could also be that you just run away, or it could be that you are just frozen, because actually it's like fight versus flight versus freeze, I guess, is the new one. You're completely overridden by your emotions. And that's kind of what he's getting at here.
Yeah, but I also think that it's interesting that rage and seeking are because I was talking about this with my kids the other day. If you're frustrated with a driver and you like verbally say something, is that road rage? Is it? I don't see. So there you go. Like I actually said we got to find another another phrase like freeway frustration or something. Driving disappointment, or driver disappointment, because there's no. And I think that, again, what he's trying to do here, and I don't know for a fact, is that the reason you're bringing he's bringing this up is like the default is to go either pure logic or pure emotion.
Yeah.
And reason needs to be a factor here. And responsiveness is the way to reason, whereas reaction might be.
Yep.
Just like the rage pathway might be. And by the way, I think it's also interesting, like the pause allows the seeking to catch up. But I would also argue that if you're in a state of flow and you're productive and you take a pause, that also gives the ability for the rage pathway to get right back in there.
It's true.
In some way, shape, or form, right? That's why flow doesn't feel like time is like it moves differently and time dilation happens and all that stuff. But if you pause, that part of your brain that goes, man, don't you just go get something to eat? Or how about you? Or you've been told you need to get up and go for walks more often. So now is the time to go walk, where you're like, well, hold on a second. This is a tough part of the task right now. So is that what my brain is trying to tell me? Or is it trying to legitimately be helpful?
Yep.
And we're asking a lot of ourselves in those moments to make those decisions. So I totally get it. And I think that actually, here we go. I'm looking at it right now. Because we're fallible humans, try as we might, anger, panic, and other reactive emotions will on occasion get the best of us.
Yep.
So again, we asked for guidance with values. We're probably getting more guidance with the actions area than we are with the values part, which is in the identity. Because, well, actions are it's pretty clear. If I say, hey, go write 500 words for this book, that's pretty clear. Like what goes on within those 500 words is different. But if you hit that 500 word target, then you've completed the task. So there's a quantifier there, right? Which often happens with this stuff. When you're dealing with qualitative stuff, which again goes back to parts 1 and part 2, that's the part where we can struggle. And what's worse is that when we struggle with it, our brains then go, see, I'm not good at this stuff. Or, we get stuck in that because it's hard. He could have gone so many ways with this too, like the different pathways and things like that. Like he could have used the hierarchy of needs, really, if he wanted to, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but that I think has been done to death as well. So yeah, I think that he's asking people to look at different pathways that I haven't heard before. And that, again, subjective approaches to objective outcomes, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really what's happening here.
I just don't think that they are distinct pathways like he frames them. I just don't like the framing, I think, of this. But I agree with the general.
Yeah, and I get that. It was a I wouldn't say it was a tougher. There was a lot of jargon. Maybe that's it too. Like there was more jargon in this chapter, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe because of the fact that he was getting to the tail end and wanted to make sure, like, if someone having a takeaway, they can get that instant hit of dopamine from doing what everything that's led up to this point.
Yep.
And that may be the crux of it. But yeah, I mean, of all the parts, the one that I didn't need to read that deeply was this one.
Chapter 6 I liked, so let's talk about that real briefly.
Sure.
Making meaning and moving forward. I think there's a really powerful idea here. Obviously, I like the idea of finding purpose. That's the idea behind the life theme. It's a personal mission statement. But he says at the very beginning of this that sometimes things just suck. Not everything has to have meaning. And also that meaning and growth emerge on their own schedule. So that's important. I think the big takeaway from this is that you don't have to create meaning and purpose for every single thing that happens. If you are constantly looking for it, it will emerge, but don't try to apply it before you actually see it.
Well, and I think probably even a different way to phrase it, if you're not, I don't think constantly looking for it can be necessarily helpful. I think if you're aware of its possibility, I think that's I think, and that's a default. That's something that, again, part 1, part 2 can prepare you for. But you're right. And here's the other thing. It's like, again, I'll go back to lessons about prioritization or anything related to time. Like, what did Merlin Mann say once? Like, if you have more than one priority, you have zero, right?
Yep.
And the idea that, so if you make, and Syndrome in The Incredibles said, like, if I make everybody a superhero, then nobody's a superhero.
Right.
So if you try to make meaning out of every single thing that happens to you, especially since we all know that not everything has to have a meaning, sometimes things just happen and, you know, right place, wrong time, or wrong place, right time, or whatever. Sometimes it just sucks. He actually alludes to this in his interview with Rich. The thing is that if you try to make meaning out of every single thing, then it dilutes the ones that are really meaningful and gives more credence to the ones that aren't. So it's about it's filtration, right?
Yep, I agree with that. The other thing I want to call out here, I can't let this go by. On page 178, I lost a little bit of respect for Brad because he mentions that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is perhaps his favorite book ever. And I hated that book.
Okay, so I like so I've told you about the posthumous book that Persig's wife published with his editor, right? Called On Quality. Just read that. Like, because Zen is long, and it's, speaking of a book that's deep, like, it's trippy. Like, you need to, and I think Zen is also, and his sequel Lila, are books that you need to be in the right frame of mind, whatever, to read. It's like, there's certain movies that if you watch them at the wrong time, you're like, whatever. And then another time you're like, wow. Like, I think that it depends on where you're at. I watched a movie I think that was recommended in our mastermind called The Divided Brain the other day, which actually, speaking of dispelling myths about the brain, the left brain and the right brain do different things than we think. And, speaking of independence and interdependence, very interesting, really great documentary called The Divided Brain. I think that, I don't think I've made it all the way through Zen, to be honest. I think I have it bookmarked, but it's, number one, I have like an original old version where it's harder to read. But I read the book On Quality, which I think Persig's work on quality is fantastic. I just read that book, which is really short and kind of, that was his life's work. So yeah, but I would never say that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is my favorite book, although I do appreciate the work that Persig did. And if I was going to pick a book of his that is, again, I like because the other thing about On Quality, it almost reads like a journal, like it's a compendium of his work. And now that he's no longer with us, and let's put it this way, I like Persig's stuff so much that when we were in Washington, D.C., my son and I, we went to the American Museum of National History because they actually have the motorcycle that him and his son went on the trip with the saddlebags and everything. But it's not on display. It's in storage. And I'm like, so my son and I, we were already in D.C. I'm like, we got to go to this museum because I want to see this motorcycle. Speaking of, and I bet you if you read Persig's book On Quality, you'll probably see that speaking of non-dual thinking, like Yeah, he definitely. Hell, that book, Zen and the Art. There's a lot of non-dual thinking and non-linear stuff going on in that book too. So,
Yep. All right, there's one more part to this book, and then we'll get to the style and rating. The last part is the conclusion, and this is with the appropriately clickbaity title, 5 questions and 10 tools for embracing change and developing rugged flexibility. This is basically a summary of the entire book. And if you wanted to get the Blinkist version of the things that are in this book, you could just jump straight to this conclusion and read it. I like the questions. I really like the idea of asking the right questions. And then I believe when you ask the right questions, then your brain helps you find the right answers. So that's much better than saying just do these things.
yeah.
And then the 10 tools are things like embrace non-dual thinking, adopt a being orientation, the summary of the big ideas throughout the book. So effective way to wrap this up, I feel, but nothing new here at this point, I don't think.
No, it was just, I mean, if anything, like you said, if you read the introduction and the conclusion, I think it's like a Blinkist or a short form version of the book. Like it doesn't get into any real depth. Yeah, I mean, I think I went over that fairly quickly. Although, yes, like you said, the tools, the questions. I think that the conclusion stuff, it would have been interesting maybe to, although I know he does have bullet points at the end of each part of like, this is what we've covered, to have some of that maybe interspersed, like some questions for you to think about and things like that. Because, like I mentioned off the top, this may be a short book, but it's not a quick read.
Yep.
So maybe, and again, you know, this could have been an editorial choice, having those questions like things to consider or, you know, activities to, you know, do might be helpful at the end of each part to kind of galvanize what each part was trying to drive home. But the conclusion was fine. I mean, as it stood.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting point because what you're talking about is essentially things that you could do next. And as
Mm-hmm.
part of the bookworm format, we've always got action items. I actually don't have any for this entire book. I feel like a lot of the mindsets and things that he talks about in here are things to keep in mind or hopefully have shifted your perspective a little bit next time that you're going through change. I know it was very helpful, but I didn't have anything specifically as like, this is something that I'm going to do from this other than try to go through change a little bit better, I guess.
Well, I think for me, you know, the idea of allostasis, like knowing that it's a term, I think that's some of the things that like it's been defined. I think that was huge.
Yeah.
So I would say that maybe that's just keeping in mind that homeostasis and allostasis are different, and we go through allostasis way more than homeostasis.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like we should dive into that a bit more. Maybe that's the big takeaway. And then everything after that is kind of like dominoes, right?
Yep.
Like what goes on in the book.
So, style and rating. I really enjoyed this book. I'm very glad that I read it. I nitpicked a few things here and there, but overall, I think it's really good. I love how focused it is. I feel like this does a great job of speaking to a specific topic, tackling it a specific way, and not trying to add a whole bunch of other ancillary things that maybe this fits, maybe this ties, maybe this connects. I really like the style. I feel like I would really like Brad if I ever meet him in person. I don't know. This just felt like a really good book at the right time for me. I do have a couple nitpicks, which we talked about earlier, so I think that's going to keep me from giving it 5 stars, but I will happily give it 4 stars, and definitely would recommend it to other people who are going through one of those disorder events that he talks about.
Which is everybody.
That's true. That's true.
But I agree. I like Brad's style of writing. I've been a fan of his work for a while. I think The Practice of Groundedness is a really great book as well. It and the style kind of carries over. So I did like this book. I think that the caveat I will throw to anybody out there is that you may not. It will take time for you to go through it. So give it this time and space it needs.
Yep.
Because there's depth here. So I would give it a 4 out of 5 as well. It's not the perfect book, but I think if anything, the reason I don't give it a full 5 is that from a vantage point of a reader that goes into this book, they may have mismanaged expectations, which the
Sure.
introduction kind of helps with, to be honest. But at the end of the day, it is a short book, but a deep book. So I think it's worthwhile to pick up. And again, if you're feeling like right now that there's a lot of chaos and disorder around you and that you've got some change going on in your life, this is going to be a helpful book for you.
Absolutely. Yep. Just don't rush through it. Like you said, take your time with it, but definitely a good one. All right. We'll wrap it up there. Stay tuned for the announcement of the next episode and the next special guest. But thanks so much, Mike, for coming on the show. For people who made it to the end, one more time, where do you want people to go to connect with you and the rest of your work?
Well, you can find me at productivityist.com. That's the word productivity with IST at the end of it.com. And again, I've got a book coming out early next year called The Productivity Diet that I'm looking forward to delivering. So yeah, that's what's, and I'm, at Mike Vardy on all the social platforms. So
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we will talk to you in a couple of weeks.